All right, looks like we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special debate version of Inlay Terms. And we picked a really good day for you today. Probably no one's watching. Everyone's getting ready for the Trump debate, but I promise ours is going to be more interesting. So without further ado, in the for corner, we have DD Carbon, which we'll call you D Cubed. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
And in the against corner, we have Mr. Buck McYoung. We're just going to call you Buck. How are you doing?
Doing great.
All right. Well, we got our first first viewer. That's good. I guess the topic of conversation, the topic of the debate for today will be the carbon tax, and we're going to have a bit of a structured debate. So, D Cubed, you're going to start with your opening statements. We'll give you 2 minutes. And then Buck, you get your 2-minute opening statement. And then from there, we'll jump into questions and we'll ping pong between you guys. So I'll ask D Cubed a question, and then he gets 2 minutes, and you have 10 minutes to debate that question. And then we'll go 2 minutes for you, Buck. And we'll do that until we're out of questions, and then we're going to get viewer questions. So any questions from you guys before we start?
Nope.
Let's do it. For me.
All right, here we go. D Cubed, your opening statements. Two minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be arguing in favor of the carbon tax and that it's a good policy, though there's definitely room for improvement in the Canadian context. This is because I fundamentally believe that the harms of climate change are worth mitigating. By that, I mean increased temperature leading to more severe storms, wildfires, and food insecurity, impacting global GDP, causing significant social costs. While there may be localized benefits, like longer growing seasons in Canada, these are generally outweighed by the broader negative impacts. Economists agree that climate change will reduce global economic output, with poorer nations suffering the most despite contributing the least to emissions. A carbon tax is an effective tool to address these issues. It aligns with the economic principle of addressing externalities such as pollution by pricing in the harm they cause in the form of CO2 emissions. This approach incentivizes producers and consumers to shift towards a lower carbon economy with minimal government intervention. It's a libertarian and conservative solution that holds those responsible for economic harm accountable. Even if no other nation implemented a carbon tax, I would still support it based on the principle of preventing harm to others. Fortunately, we're not doing this alone. Over 30 nations, including major emitters like the EU and China, have adopted carbon taxing schemes. And as renewable energy has become more cost competitive, particularly in China, who leads the world in renewable installations, we see a clear path forward to a sustainable and economically viable future. I, like most Canadians, see the cost of living crisis here and don't want to add to it. And I think that most people generally agree that we want a strong economy and a healthy environment. I think it's important to ask yourself for questions like this, though. What would it take to change your mind? In my case, it would be if the costs of mitigating climate change were outweighed by the benefits. At the end of the day, the consumer will always bear the costs of mitigation of climate change or adaptation to it. But at least with a carbon tax, we can choose to what degree we bear those costs. That's why I support the carbon tax as a pragmatic and efficient tool to mitigate climate change, to drive economic growth, and uphold the principle of preventing harm to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, D Cubed. Buck, now it's your turn. You got 30 seconds. Go ahead.
All right. Great to be debating with you, D Cubed. I am obviously on the position that the carbon tax is not a policy that is appropriate for Canada, and I'll get into those reasons. But let me first by stating where we have no disagreement, which will clarify where we do. The climate is changing. It always has. It always will. In fact, by historical standards, this particular interglacial period we live in has been anomalously stable. We have less climate change now than is the norm for planet Earth. But nonetheless, the climate is changing. The heart of this debate should revolve around three questions. What are the primary causes of climate change? What effects do humans have on climate change? And what should humans do about the climate change with particular respect to the carbon tax? So the first two of these questions should be entirely scientific endeavors. And I hope that you'll indulge me that I don't consider it a settled science, and we can dig into some of that. The last question is entirely political. However, the climate change debate has made the first two questions political and pretends that the last one is purely scientific. I intend to establish through this debate that this rhetorical sleight of hand has been carefully constructed to suppress people's understanding of the relevant data and science, and to suppress their political speech with bad faith social attacks on good faith scientific and economic debate. And in doing so, I expect that our listeners will come to appreciate that the carbon tax is not a science-based policy, but a baseless, undemocratic, inefficient, and anti-human policy used for craven political purposes and economic graft. I'll relinquish my time and hopefully we can use it later on.
Thank you, Buck, and apologies for saying you only had 30 seconds. I think you picked up on my mistake.
That's all right.
So we're going to go directly into the questions now. D cubed, your first question. Presumably there's a problem which you wish to address by implementing this carbon tax. Can you please explain what that problem is? You have 2 minutes.
I think it lines up well with Buck's opening statement in that I agree with the fundamental questions that he was stating, at least that we should pin them down. But in terms of what it's trying to address, I think that carbon dioxide causes harm, and that harm isn't priced into the economic system that we have, so we should price it in. This is no different than what we did with lead and gasoline, or CFCs, or acid rain. And it's broadly how we regulate other industries like chemical manufacturing, where we put limits on the concentration of a chemical that you can release into the environment. Or sin taxes like alcohol and cigarettes. Yeah, like we regulate all kinds of pollutions, be it air, light, water, sound, etc. And I just see this as a pollution that's not adequately accounted for. And so I guess my question to Buck would be, in a world where climate change is real, human caused, and causing economic harms and damages, given all of that as a true statement, would you support a carbon tax? Because to my understanding, it's like it falls just under the concept of externality that we apply in every other avenue.
Well, I don't want to just sort of breeze over what I think is actually quite substantive. I do want to dig into it. I would say that I would agree in principle that taxation can be used to deal with externalities. I reserve a bunch of criticisms I have about the form of carbon taxation that we're doing because I think it really fails to live up to some of the fundamental assumptions that must be held true when using a tax to deal with an externality. So maybe we can return to that a little bit later, but like I'll concede sort of in principle that taxation it can be used to address market failures, if that's sufficient to your question.
Yeah. It's just so that we have at least some agreement going forward, just so that I understand where to take time. But yeah.
Well, so maybe you could dig in for me, because you call carbon dioxide pollution. I think you sort of accept that axiomatically. Maybe you could talk to us about why you consider that appropriate. I think the textbook definition of pollution is a toxic substance, something that causes harm. But I don't understand how ubiquitous natural chemical that is essential for life considered pollution. I wouldn't put it in the same camp as I don't know, hydrogen sulfide or something of that nature. Maybe you could talk to us about how you come to that conclusion.
Sure. I think this falls more under like a little bit of something is good. Then there's kind of a perfect amount, and then there you can have too much of anything, right? You can die from a water overdose or things like that, right? Sulfur dioxide is totally natural. It gets released from volcanoes and things like that, but it still causes acid rain, which obviously is an externality that we decided was bad and priced into our market systems. So okay. I see it in that sense, in that we've crossed the hump, and the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere causes negative harm. But CO2, like I wouldn't say CO2 blanket causes harm. Obviously, below 200 ppm pretty much kills all life on Earth,
right.
At least for practical purposes. But exceeding kind of the 300 ppm range up into the 400s where we are is causing economic harm that would make it considered a pollution. But bringing
Okay.
it down to something like 300, you wouldn't consider it a pollution anymore. I think.
Okay. And so I appreciate that you've sort of made a concession for us there that, we're talking about a matter of degree, that it's not de facto a problem, but that I think you've also said, we decided it's a problem, right? And so I think there is some ground to dig into there about what's the appropriate level. You've also acknowledged that, by sort of geologic standards, we were approaching the red line of death during the last ice age, or frankly, all of the ice ages that have occurred in the last million years, below which, photosynthesis is impossible. And really that's the primary source of energy, directly or indirectly, for almost all life on Earth. And so, so we've sort of understood the lower bound, and then you've talked a little bit about where you see sort of the upper bound creating harm. I wonder if you would also, if I could, request that you'd acknowledge there may be benefits as well. And so really what we're talking about is a cost-benefit analysis. Is that something that you would entertain?
Yeah, 100%. I said that in my opening statement, how there's certainly going to be benefits. The IPCC does a good job of recognizing those. They quantify certain storms that would actually decrease in damage and probability. They very readily admit that, like, places like Canada will probably have longer growing seasons and more arable land, albeit more marginal land, things like that. So yeah, it's a cost benefit, but on the aggregate, it would be net negative.
Okay, and would you also acknowledge that climate change, the change in global temperature, is a phenomenon that happens absent human involvement, has as recently as the last 1,000 years. And maybe you could put some of those temperature fluctuations in context for us vis-a-vis what the IPCC is reporting. When you say we are having damage here, how do you tease out the difference between natural variability in global temperatures and that which is anthropogenic?
Yeah, so again, that's all laid out pretty well in the IPCC, basically in that they measure the different forcings of different global systems. So things like solar radiance and volcanic activity being kind of the main natural drivers, at least things that would add to the overall system. And yeah, nobody disagrees that the climate has changed, always will change. It's more the rate of change within a small time frame, and is that human caused or is it not? And the answer is yes. It's for all practical purposes 100% human caused, but there's some arguments that it's even higher. Because
I'm sorry, 100%. You're saying? That's no climate scientist would allege that. That's a patently false statement. Okay, so let me just give you some historical context here. What's unambiguously clear is that atmospheric carbon dioxide varies with global temperature. There's very strong correlation in the climatological record. You look at those Antarctic ice cores, a million years of data, we see that every time we have an ice age, the Earth is covered in ice, we've got atmospheric at 180. And then when it warms up, we're up to 300 plus, right? And so that's a correlation, not causation, right? And so say that. Yeah. So I just want to put in, if you zoom out from before the Industrial Revolution, you've got 3/4 of a degree of global temperature change happening in less than 100 years, absent any human impact. And you're telling me that 100% of the climate change that we are observing over the next 100 years is human caused?
So when I'm talking about climate change, I'm specifically talking about from 1900 onwards, because that was during the Industrial Revolution when we started burning all of these hydrocarbons. So that is important context. When we're talking about the last about 1,000 years, the climate really hasn't fluctuated very much.
But it has. I'll highlight a couple points. I just don't want to let you state something that I can easily refute here. We're talking about, periods of time like 1700 to 1800, that 100 years before we all of our graphs start. We had a 0.5 degree rise in global temperature. In a 50-year period from 1200 to 1250, we had a 0.5 degree rise in global temperature. From 1400 to 1450, a 0.75 degree drop in global temperature. So, I mean, these are not unprecedented levels of climate change, absent human involvement.
So I think it's really important here when we're looking at this is that I read your blog. You showed what I assume you're talking about, the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. It's really important to understand that came from the 1990 IPCC report, where the author specifically said that they thought that was a regional impact, and that data is from the 1950s and 60s. We've gotten much, much better at climate analysis at this point, and if you were to look at the IPCC now, they would show very little aggregate change. There's obviously spikes and dips in certain cases, but the total change is less than 0.5 degree over the last about 1,000 years. There's been very little change within that time frame, but there's been a whole lot of change between 1900 and today. And that is the most updated and recent information on it. Things like the Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period didn't actually happen given the data that we have now and the advancements of 50 years of research, data analytics, and involvement. So to my understanding, that's where you're pulling this information from. But I can assure you, if you look at the IPCC report, it shows the different forcings of different things. They show the natural forcings since 1900. They're basically zero. The main forcings on climate change and right now are aerosols, so things like SO2 that reflects radiation away from Earth, so it actually has a cooling effect, and then positive forcings like carbon dioxide and methane and NO2s or NOxs. And when you aggregate all those, it's very clear that natural forces are having basically no impact, and some estimations a negative impact, such that the Earth would have been getting colder since 1900 had humans not burned any fossil fuels, which means that our total impact versus 1900 is potentially above 100%, if that makes sense.
I'm just going to jump in here. We've crossed the 10-minute mark, but Buck, I'll let you respond to that and then maybe go to the next question.
No, I mean, I can go into it. I think I'll just take the opportunity to go into my 2 minutes. And, you may quibble a little bit with temperature records over the last 1,000 years. There's plenty of opportunity for me to quibble with the data over the current 100 years, things like the heat island effect, and as well as some interpolation of data that is inappropriate. We can talk about East Anglia and the emails that were exposed. And, I think we'll just, as opposed to diving in and debating all of this, which will be just torturous for the viewers, we'll let them decide whether they think that there's no natural variation in climate, whether it's from changes in solar activity, whether it's the Milankovitch cycles, whether it's the effect of volcanoes and so forth. So I think that assertion that there is no natural climate change associated with any of the warming that we're seeing is a bit spurious. But what I will say is I think it's absolutely clear that there are far larger forces than CO2 that impact the Earth's climate. Those forces can act on relatively short time scales as well. For example, I find it curious that the 2030, 2050 targets for major climate initiatives correspond with low points in solar sunspot activity. And I know this, I know that this IPCC does not address solar particle forcing in any of its models because I looked it up. And this roughly decadal oscillation, which has a direct impact on the Earth's climate, both in terms of the radiant flux of energy, not light, but actually charged particles that are coming, huge volumes of charged particles that are impacting the Earth that are very hot, but also that particle that enter the atmosphere impact cloud formation, and cloud formation obviously affects albedo, which is an important part of the energy balance. I mean, probably the primary driver of the energy balance of our system. And so, it seems to me these obvious confounders, which are not part of the IPCC report, have been overlooked, maybe for intentional reasons. And so, one small quibble, there's a lot more that I could quibble about IPCC, but let me just sort of summarize by saying we cannot reduce the Earth's tremendous complexity, down to CO2 acting like a thermostat, because the Earth is a climate system that is not a simple linear equation. It's a complex adaptive system, and those types of systems confound predictive analysis. And so we only need to see, how many climate predictions have not come to pass as the evidence of the difficult inherity in such analyses. You've already acknowledged to me that, the IPCC has restated several times and changed its models. And those examples include dire warnings about coral reef loss and Pacific islands being swallowed up, and ice-free Arctic summers, and losses of habitat. So the data has consistently refuted many of these predictions. And you can say, well, we updated the models and we got better data and we understand better now. But I think that is a form of technocratic hubris that says, well, of course we were wrong before because we didn't know, but now we know. We know how this insanely complicated system works, and so you just got to trust us on this. And so, anyways, I would just say until those things can be ascertained, nobody should be making such bold claims like 100% of all observed climate change is associated with human activity. I think that is patently false. But anyway, so maybe we can, if there's anything else you want to discuss in the science without bogging our listeners down, I'm willing to, but I'll just sort of let you respond, and then maybe we can move on to the tax aspects of this.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here, Buck, the next question I was going to ask you would be just like, what's your position against the climate change narrative, which we're already there. So why don't I let D Cubed respond to you, because you talked for quite a bit there.
Sure. The IPCC includes the heat island effect. They write about it very often. They largely don't include cities in their estimations. They only include it more in the sense that cities will get hotter at a faster rate than rural areas, and that will obviously be a climate impact. The East Anglia emails, that is an interesting topic, probably not one that we want to go into, but anybody can look it up. It was an email hack, and it was a lot of emails taken out of context of scientists talking very candidly, and pushed for a very specific narrative. When you actually look into the emails, they're very innocuous. Solar activity has been decreasing for the last couple decades. So we know that solar activity actually isn't playing an impact in total temperature, and that's how you could have estimates above 100%, because the sun does play such an instrumental role in temperatures, such that if it went away, obviously we would all die. Volcanic activity is about 1/100th of the effect of humans. So you could argue about 1%. Like I said, for all practical purposes, climate change is 100% human caused. We account for all of these environmental factors. In terms of water vapor and clouds, those are also analyzed, and there is some uncertainty there. That uncertainty is understood and accounted for. That's why we do things, why we have error bars. If you read anything in the IPCC, they mention their uncertainties, they mention the error bars, they mention the ranges that things are. This is how scientists go about their work. And so the cloud effect, broadly speaking, has actually a positive forcing, albeit quite small. If we were looking at the third IPCC report, then some of those statements would be accurate. But again, as we've been able to research these things, these topics for longer, it's not a matter of like technocratic nature, but spending more time, having more people, having more resources, having better technology systems to investigate this information can give us higher levels of accuracy. In terms of models have been broadly correct throughout history. With climate change, they're actually remarkably accurate. There's lots of studies that use the old models. You can do them yourselves, and I've done it myself, where you can use models made in the 80s and 90s and predict today's climate change and warming predicated on carbon emissions. Yeah, I think that does most of it. In terms of ice-free, at 2 degrees Celsius, we're looking at ice-free summers in the Arctic once every 10 years. At 1.5 degrees, it's once every 100 years. A lot of this climate alarmism that you're talking about was largely from politicians and non-scientists, but the scientists have been a lot more clear about this information, though scientists are typically bad at communicating that information to laymen and politicians and other people. And that seems to be where a lot of the disconnect comes between what scientists are saying and what people think, and the fear mongering that goes along with climate change. And I agree, that's been a problem for decades. But it doesn't change what the reality of the information is.
I have a suggestion. We can keep going down this road. I'm just worried that you guys are going to just get more and more entrenched, and it's going to get like the audience is just going to stop caring.
That's right.
Would you guys be comfortable moving on to the next question? It's non-scientific.
Well, I just say this. I mean, if you look at the, I appreciate that you pointed out the error bars in the IPCC. I think that is exactly what I'm talking about. They acknowledge themselves that they don't fully understand. They don't have a perfect grasp. And if you look at the qualifications, they acknowledge the sources of natural impacts that have uncertainties associated with them. But even beyond that, when you look at the different models of where we might go in the future, many of those are predicated on things as simple as the population of the planet. And the most recent IPCC report still uses an outdated UN population growth model that is obviously broken, intending to bring us to, over 9.5 billion people, which we're not going to hit. We might be at peak humanity here in the next decade or so. So, when there are obviously, like that is going to have a greater impact on the amount of carbon emissions that are released is our population growth. And we are well below, what they're forecasting. If they can't get the population model right, I'm pretty skeptical of layering uncertainty on uncertainty on uncertainty. Anyways, yeah, I appreciate that you've acknowledged that there's some uncertainty there, but maybe we can dive into the tax aspects then.
Very well. I guess we can move on to the next question. This one is for you, D-Cubed. People will point to the war income tax of 1917, which was intended to be temporary and modest. And I don't think it's gotten bigger and bigger, and it's no longer temporary as it's still there. Some people claim that this carbon tax will be just like the war income tax. It's going to get bigger and bigger, and it's going to be here forever. What is your response to that?
My response is that's accurate with what you would want it to do. You do want it to slowly increase over time so that firms have an understanding of where that cost is going to be, and they can price in that to their economic trade-off analyses. So say I'm a natural gas company and I'm building a natural gas plant, and I know that the carbon tax is going to increase systematically, then I can price in, is carbon capture a valuable technology to invest in or not? And that's really the incentive structure of it. And it doesn't change the reality of it being an economic harm. So I don't think it should ever be priced out of the market unless we were to come down to like 300 ppm, or as Buck said in his blog, like, yeah, we could get hit by like a meteor or something and that could throw everything out of whack, and then or go into an ice age where we would want more CO2 emissions. Things could change, but at least for right now, it's causing economic harm. So as long as it's causing economic harm, we should price it into the market. And I said this on your show, I'm in full agreement with a 250 USD per ton carbon tax, kind of being the likely end limit, or kind of top end that we would see for the most part. Yeah.
Buck, what's your response?
Well, can I kind of give my fulsome one, or just sort of a bit of repartee on the issue? I mean, I guess I'm very curious to understand how we are coming up with these very precise numbers. That would imply that we're able to quantify the cost entirely. It also would imply that we're able to quantify the benefit. So maybe you could dig into that. If we've got these uncertainties in the model, which you've already acknowledged, and how can we be coming up with such a precise estimate based on a imprecise model? And then, I guess it's even more curious how we can also, do this cost benefit analysis. What would you mark as the benefits here that are being weighed against the costs?
Sure. So, I mean, I think this gets into what you were saying before, where we're talking about these models. I think it's a little bit of a throwaway to just say, hey, like, these are models on models on models. There's uncertainty. How could we ever know? When you come from doing models like I do in my own work, there's a joke that's like, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And that's kind of the area that we're in here. Any prediction or estimate that we're going to make is inherently going to be wrong. It's just how wrong is it? What's the directionality that we're going in, and how big are those error bars? And so when we're quantifying the cost benefit analyses, it's very clear from economists, even the ones that you cite in your blog, that they're all for carbon taxes. Richard Toll probably being the low end, where he's estimating in the area of like 30 USD per ton right now. And then Nordhaus being a little bit higher, and then other climate estimators being much, much higher, up in the $160, $170 per ton range. And that gets into different modeling styles and things like the social cost of carbon. So it's really hard to put a price on certain things. Like, say you move to Victoria because you love to scuba dive, and then climate change destroys the reefs there and the wildlife. Well, now, how do you quantify what that cost is? So different social costs of carbon can be quantified in different ways. And there's definitely nuance and argument within this field. But basically, every climate modeler agrees that economic damage is going to be on the aggregate worse. They just disagree on what that price should be. So I think at the very minimum, the price should be 30 USD per ton, because that seems to be the bottom end of it, which would be about $20 more than the Canadian one once you aggregate it across all of the sectors which have carbon tax carve-outs. We're only at about 20 USD per ton.
Well, now that we're talking about taxes, we're out of the realm of science, we're firmly into the area of politics. And so, basic economic theory states that any tax policy is going to create a dead waste loss in the economy. The argument for carbon taxation that you're putting forward is that it incorporates that externality associated with particular activity, releasing carbon, and that the benefit of incorporating that externality outweighs the dead weight loss. To do that cost benefit analysis, we must know about what all of that is. And so you've got climate models, you've got biological models, physics models, solar, celestial models. Then you've got the human behavioral models and the economic models. These are all built on top of incomplete climate science that you've acknowledged associated with those error bars. So social sciences, with all their weaknesses and poor predictive value, are deployed on top of obviously incomplete scientific models that seek to reduce massive complexity down to some simple physics equation. To my knowledge, no one has presented the data in a comprehensive way. For example, the PMOs ordered its bureaucrats to withhold such economic analysis, however incomplete it is, from the Canadian public. Those experts that you talked about, the economists that came out and wrote that open letter, they're paid sole source contracts for the government. So I don't cite those as authorities. But even the analysis that I've seen that are used to justify a certain price per ton conspicuously fail to acknowledge the positive externalities associated with a warming planet, including with increased CO2, including increased agricultural yields, increased usable land mass and farmland. Canada alone will benefit 4.2 million square kilometers of farmland if the Earth's temperature continues to rise. Even climate change researchers recognize that global temperatures are expected to increase the Earth's cultivable land mass over the next 100 years. So, I guess what I'm saying is that if you add error bars on error bars on error bars, and then sort of claim that this is science, that is a misappropriation of the term. And frankly, science is like a process by which, we are ruling out things to confirm something. And so, with all of this uncertainty, we have not ruled things out. But let's talk about the carbon tax itself to further elucidate the politics. First of all, the policy is not universal. It's not a simple relationship between carbon output and tax. Many industries are exempt, like agricultural diesel. Many emissions are not taxed, like the concrete industry. Furthermore, there are regional differences in the schemes that are explicitly based on political considerations. For instance, maritime home heating oil is not part of the carbon tax. Quebec is being granted exemptions that will result in them paying 40% less per ton than the rest of us by 2030. This is obviously unfair and undermines the constitutional authority of this program, according to the Supreme Court of Canada. And it is creating a political crisis in this country. And so, even if I were to grant to you that you were right on all of the science and we had this perfect analysis of the situation, we still have to factor in the politics here. And if we tear our country apart over something like this, that I think you've acknowledged without a globally coordinated effort is not going to have any impact, because we'll just shift manufacturing outside of carbon tax jurisdictions and then import those products back in and really have had no impact on the level of consumption. This is an ineffective program as it stands. And so, look, the other thing here is that an essential element of a carbon tax program is that it's going to be able to change behavior. And you've got a situation where you've got hyperdense, you've got people living in cities that are low carbon lifestyles. I think you're one of these individuals. It's not changing your behavior. You're not driving a car. But for folks who don't have access to public transit, who can't decide whether their grid is hydroelectric or nuclear, this tax has no impact on their behavior because energy consumption is inelastic. And so really you're just punishing people for where they live.
We should let him respond. Sorry, Buck. Maybe we should let DQ respond. Go ahead.
Okay. There's a lot there. Most of the end bit there, I would largely be in agreement with you. I think that there's, I like the carbon tax in Canada more on the principle that we have one, but there's certainly better ways to accomplish it. There's certainly better ways to do it. At the top of my list, I would put import carbon taxes like the EU is planning on doing. That would deal with the offshoring and would actually be protectionist in nature, because lower travel distance means less carbon emissions, broadly speaking. I agree that the political exemptions and the exemptions all over the place, I disagree with. I would much rather see us reduce our carbon tax to 30 USD per ton across the board for everything, than have this weird quasi system where we have exemptions or non exemptions and things like that, because I think it would actually do the thing that we want it to do. You're right. I do get to live a more low carbon lifestyle because I live in a city. And that's, again, where I think on the margins of the tax, you can say, hey, like people in cities should get a little bit less. The carbon tax rural rebate was increased from 10% to 20%. Maybe you argue that it's even higher. I think those are totally fair and reasonable. But the federal government can only do so much. When we have a provincial government like Alberta's that decided to put a moratorium on renewable energy systems, that's going to hurt these options that could exist and things like that. And Alberta could be like Texas if it deregulated a lot of these markets and allowed renewables to be built more liberally across the nation to provide the cheapest power possible. Again, I think we're going to disagree till the end of the world on these models. It's not a matter of models being built on top of models and models and models. It's a matter of us being able to look at historical damages, quantify those numbers, see what's changing. As much as certain cases could be, we could have uncertainties in, we know what the end answers are. In many of these cases, we can build ground up models where we look at specific sectors and how they are directly affected by climate change, or we can look at kind of these top down models on how the systems are broadly changing. Again, it's not necessarily about being 100% precisely accurate, but it's about where do all of these models trend towards, and what are those error bars on? And like I said, I'd be happy. I think there's an interesting discussion to be had there. Yeah.
I got to push back on that. It does matter. If you're making the argument that a carbon tax is creating market efficiency, you have to get it right. Otherwise, you're incurring a deadweight loss on the economy, and you're not adequately,
Yes.
setting your price and changing behavior. So
Yes.
there is the only justification for this is if you have it right. And I'm saying that there's no way that we can have it right.
But
we just don't know.
that's not what I'm saying. You can get it wrong as long as you're underestimating, though, because if you don't apply the carbon tax, then it's all a deadweight loss for whatever that externality is. But if you're below, then you're at least accounting for some of it, right? This is the same argument you would make for Georgism if you mess up what the land value taxes are. You don't necessarily have to get it 100% correct, but starting to price it in and working towards that solution is still better than nothing at all, because it still accounts for what you're trying to accomplish, even if it's not 100% effective.
Well, unfortunately, the economic data would disagree with you. The fact that we have imposed a carbon tax where all these other jurisdictions have not has resulted in capital flight and manufacturing flight from the country, right? And so if you don't get it universal and you don't get it right, what you have is the market doing what it does best and avoiding the taxation. So you still have the carbon emissions, right? Our EV batteries are made in China with dirty, grid systems over there, and then they're put into vehicles and shipped over here. There's 60,000 kilometers worth of carbon built into an EV vehicle before it rolls off the line, right? And so if all of that is happening just in another jurisdiction and doesn't show up in your analysis, you've not solved the problem. You've just hindered an economy and patted yourself on the back because you think you solved the problem. You just exported the problem that you're trying to tackle.
Again, you would implement import carbon taxes like the EU is planning on doing and Canada has already flirted with, right?
Well, we are doing it because we're putting a huge tariff on Chinese EV vehicles.
I mean, that's a little bit of a distortion on the way that the import taxes would work, but like it shouldn't be specific to a country, but yeah.
So let me tackle these. Let me ask you to tackle these 3 points about these are the premises, the assumptions that are built into this type of taxation. It must be connected to the thing that is driving the negative externality in a universal way. It must the market participants must have the agency to change their behavior, and then the tax must be proportional to address all contributors of the negative externality. If the tax, because the tax itself will result in a distortion if you get it wrong. So, how does somebody in Alberta who doesn't have control over their grid, right? How are they changing their behavior when, they just happen to be born in a province with no hydroelectric?
Yeah. Again, we knew that this tax was coming in 2019. It slowly is implemented and it gets recycled back into the economy. So when we're talking about what somebody can do as an individual, it can be quite small changes to get large marginal impacts back on it. So you would hope that the carbon tax rebates cover those additional costs. But if we're assuming a case where it doesn't, then it's options like, okay, can you reduce car use? Can you
well, so hold on a second. The folks in the Maritimes get an exemption because they don't want to replace their oil furnaces. But the folks in Alberta,
that's wrong.
You're telling me that from 2019 they knew this was coming. They were supposed to tear down their entire energy production infrastructure and rebuild it in 4 years. But the folks in the Maritimes, they can't replace a furnace?
No, I'm you're misrepresenting what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is that we had 5 years now to know that these taxes are going to be slowly and incrementally increasing, right? So it should have been on those provincial governments to say, hey, we need to decarbonize our grid. Again, in the case of Danielle Smith putting a moratorium on renewable energy, she's screwing over those people who could otherwise get renewable power, but can't now because of her policy decisions. Again, I'm not going to sit here and agree with the political games
So
that
it
Trudeau
is
is playing with the.
It is not fair. It's
Okay,
not
but
uniform.
any policy can be used politically. It doesn't mean that the system itself as a concept is bad, right? So I agree with you, but like you can do that with any policy. You can tear apart any policy decision and use it in a political way. That doesn't mean
So it is
that the
political.
concept is. No, I'm
It's not
saying it
political.
can be. No, it can be used politically. Any government policy
Good,
can
and
be
it
used
has been
politically.
used politically, right? I mean, we're talking about
Yeah, of course.
liberal basic income.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
We're talking about taking money from suburbs and rural areas and transferring wealth into liberal ridings. You can see it in the polling.
Okay, no, that's ridiculous.
It's not. Do that analysis. If you look at the carbon intensity of living in cities and the suburbs and rurally, you will find an odd correlation between those liberal strongholds that still exist and those places where the carbon tax benefits those. It's a net benefit. The PBO has already said that the majority of Canadians are worse off economically because of the carbon tax. That whole 8 in 10 get more money back was an assessment of direct only. And it just came out in committee like this week. So the majority of 60% of Canadians are worse off. That money is being pulled out of the suburbs, pulled out of the rural areas, and handed out as a unearned benefit to people who live in cities. And the truth is, we can't increase our cities more. Look at the infrastructure in Calgary that's falling apart. This whole notion that folks in the city have that everybody in Canada can just live in shoeboxes in the sky is it's a fallacy. First of all, our economy just doesn't work that way because we need people to live rurally. And so the people who are the economic engine of this nation are the ones who are paying the price of this policy. This is a wealth transfer to liberal ridings.
I'm just going to jump in here. You guys are doing great, but let's remember to be civil. And both of you, try not to cut each other off, please. DQ, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is just going to be mostly a matter of opinion, I guess, at this point. But I think it's very reasonable from a carbon tax recycling perspective that you would give rural areas, which happen to be rural ridings, more back because it's harder for them to decarbonize. It doesn't have to be some sort of government conspiracy that they're trying to drum up votes or whatever you're trying to get at here. It can just be a reasonable policy decision based off of the ability for people to decarbonize for themselves. When we're talking about the PBO report, you're right. The 8 and 10 is about directs only. But when you're talking about the 80% getting less back, that's talking about the indirects only.
No, sorry, the PBO said 60% of Canadians on an all-in basis are worse off because of the carbon tax.
And that's because they were only directed to look at the negative consequences. They didn't look at they had no other basis for their counterfactual, right? The counterfactual for this case is literally nothing. It's not the damage from climate change. It's not economic harms in that case. It's not how divestment would go away from these fossil fuels industry. They mentioned specifically that almost all of that cost they're talking about is due to disinvestment within fossil fuel industries and reduction of portfolio value within the fossil fuel industry. That's what they very specifically say. And they don't include any of the other positives of if you're investing in infrastructure, if you're investing into these renewable systems, again, because renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels now, and cheap power is going to drive economic improvement, none of that is included. And that this is estimates for 2030. I think that's really important to understand with the PBO report in what its directive was looking at. And this was all described by Eves when he talks about it, and he talks about how it's misrepresented.
If you just made the contention that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, then it seems like the market should just find that equilibrium, should it not? What do we need the carbon tax for if it's cheaper to use renewables than it is to use fossil fuels?
because renewables aren't the only system that we need. And by adding a carbon tax, again, you're pricing in the negative harms of those fossil fuels, and that increases the delta between the two items. So if I have two items, one's $10 and one's $11, the decision making isn't going to be as clear, right? But if the difference is $10 and $15, then you have a bigger delta driving more investment into that system.
Well, you might be aware that there is a report that does talk about what the mitigation on emissions has been as a result of the carbon tax. And you might also be aware that our Minister of Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, has told the senior bureaucrat that he is not to release that report to the public. So I would just push back and say, well, if there's a benefit here, surely we can quantify it and put it into a report and share it with the public. I find it odd that that report is not fit for public consumption, and I would argue that it's probably because it's had no impact on emissions, even though Canada's are a relatively small amount, because energy consumption is highly inelastic.
Yeah, I mean, that's just speculation at this point. It's very possible. I think the best case example we have is BC, but they apply their carbon tax more liberally across the economy, and they saw a 15% reduction in their CO2 emissions per capita, which is really great. We see this across the EU as well. I would argue that the way that the Canadian federal carbon tax has been implemented is probably not high enough to drive a lot of these changes that we want and see the step changes that we would want. Again, for something like carbon capture on natural gas plants, you would need a carbon tax of around 70 USD per ton, when right now its effectiveness is probably $15 to $20 USD per ton. So it's more economical to just pay that fine, essentially, rather than implement carbon capture technology. Again, another reason you would want the carbon tax, because you're trying to incentivize lower carbon emissions. So, yeah.
What about, if you feel that it's appropriate that we start putting taxes on negative externalities, I think if you were to extend that rationale, we should probably be putting taxes on EV batteries for the child labor associated with their production. Doesn't this take us into essentially a realm where we rely on a bunch of technocrats to essentially do the math with their actuarial tables and decide the prices of everything in the economy? And doesn't that look an awful lot more like a centrally planned economy than a free market?
I think if you want to paint it that way, maybe. But again, we can price in at least the bottom end of how much damage carbon dioxide causes to the planet and economies broadly. And so at the very least, we should just put it at the minimum. Again, I would say 30 USD across the board on all sectors in Canada, and you'd at least account for some of the externality cost.
How do you price in that ecological damage associated with the mining of cobalt?
You can do economic analyses on it to, again, look at CO2 emissions, look at health outcomes, look at loss of life, look at all of these different things. I'm sure if you looked for a study on it, it would probably exist.
What's the value of a child working in an open pit mine?
I think it's terrible, and we should stop it and we should move to cobalt reserves that are in Canada, and lithium reserves that are in Canada and the United States, and nickel reserves that are in Canada and the United States, and move to battery systems like we are with storage battery systems that are predicated on sodium and iron and
well, we used to.
Batteries.
So there's an open pit mine in Idaho, near Cobalt, Idaho, that was in operation up until the 90s. They actually closed it down because it had caused contamination of local water supplies, and people, we shut these mines down because they were terribly toxic. And in fact, the Department of Defense has just reinvested in that mine and is bringing it online. So I guess what you're condoning here is that we're essentially bringing that environmental damage back here because I guess we value the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere more than we do the rivers in Idaho.
I would highly disagree with that. Mining and environmental damage is largely going to be predicated on the regulations and institutions you have within a country. So something like mining, I'm more familiar with Bingham Mine near Utah. It has some of the worst like SO2 sulfuric acid runoff in basically history of mines, and they are still cleaning up those consequences because that mine is really, really old. But luckily, because of the investment and the regulations that the states have put in since then, we've been able to substantially mitigate and reduce those negative harms and externalities.
So what we're talking about is a system where the government is agreeing to purchase a commodity above a market price. It's also defining a set of regulations that bake in a certain cost, and essentially is taxing a competitor technology to reduce its economic utility. This doesn't feel like a free market to me. This doesn't seem like a market to me at all.
So free markets are great, but they have problems, and those problems need to be mitigated by government intervention. Pollution.
So you do want the government to control the economy, then?
No, I don't want the government to control the economy as a whole. I think it's important to have a nuanced take on this, that the government has benefits and negatives to it, and free markets have benefits and negatives to it. And our job from like a government perspective would be to mitigate the positives and negatives to the best of our abilities. But letting a free market run wild is also not very good, right? It's not some binary of yes or no, where socialism is where the government does stuff. It's that we need both of them, and they need to keep each other in check, and they need to be utilized to the best of their abilities. And implementing externalities for pollution seems to be a really good position for governments to step into, right?
Well, heavy metals in rivers, I'll agree, is definitely pollution, and I'm on board with protecting our rivers and waterways and our water sources and our aquifers. I don't agree that CO2 is pollution, and I kind of chafe when I hear it described as such. But I am reminded of a famous Thomas Sowell quote that says, "There are no solutions; there are only trade-offs." And so, I maybe if I could offer that as my parting thought on this whole conversation, is that a lot of this is described as some sort of utopian vision that we are creating a green earth that, I guess all of our farmland will be plowed down and solar panels put up, and we're going to pollute rivers and open pit mine here near important ecological waterways. But I would say that there is a lot to be understood yet about what we are engaging in here, and the utopian vision that is articulated to us, at least by the politicians. Granted, maybe the real scientists with a lot of integrity are not making hyperbolic claims, and they are not overselling their position. But I think clearly in the case of the carbon tax in Canada here, we have nothing but politics because of all of these obvious deficiencies, both in the tax policy, the failure to report on whether it's had any efficacy, and the characterization here of those like me who resist it as some sort of science-denying lunatics. But I appreciate that you have not made that slur of me today, and I thank you, DCubed, for your time on this. Any other thoughts or final jabs you want to make my way?
No, I would just say broadly, like, if you don't believe that climate change is real and causes economic damage or harm, then I think it makes perfect sense to be against it as a policy. But I think if you agree with the statement that climate change is real and causes economic damage and harm, then you should support carbon taxing policy. And I think it's inherently conservative, inherently libertarian, and I think it's much better than like Poilievre's plan of technology over taxes. That seems like it's a lot more market control than simply adding what tantamounts to a fine or a regulation like we do in every other industry, be it chemical or otherwise.
Are we at the end of the debate? Are you guys all debated out?
I think we covered a lot of territory. I think even the NDP said that they don't think the carbon tax is the be all and the end all, which I think is an interesting observation.
Well, that's usually because they would be in favor of more aggressive solutions. A lot of, again, it tends to be more on the conservative side that the carbon tax is the be all end all, and then more on the what I'll call left wing or liberal side tends to be more government regulations and control systems, and like literal kind of stop, more like we did with CFCs, where we said no more CFCs. That seems that is more likely where that type of position would be going.
I'm just going to read out what Tax Carbon Please said. If there's no consensus on whether climate change is or is not real, then we're just kind of going around in circles.
Yeah.
Well, let me say, I'm not. I started this by saying climate change is real. I disagree as to the degree at which we, as a species, and we as a nation, have an impact on that. And in the absence of that certainty, I think a taxation is a guaranteed loss with a speculative benefit.
Yeah. Again, like I said, basically every economist and climate modeler on this topic agrees that total climate damage is negative. Again, there's a nuanced discussion to be had on to what degree that is. That's why I use 30 USD as the floor. But I almost would be certain that that would be an underestimate of the total damage.
Like D-Cubed, if the U.S. pulls out of Paris when Trump comes in, because he pulled out last time he got elected, and I mean, who knows? Maybe Joe Biden is comatose right now in the middle of that debate. But like realistically, here, the United States, there's a very high chance the United States pulls out. If there's degradation of the global trade order, you probably see China pull out. India's not a part of it. If the whole of the world does not get on board with this model, and we're just out there by ourselves, or whatever, Europe has deindustrialized as well, and we can all eat roots and starve in the winter, or and probably what we really do is start burning wood, which doesn't factor in your analysis, is impossible to police, and is one of those unforeseen, unintended consequences of a policy like this. There is a point at which this just doesn't work, right? You'll acknowledge that if the whole world doesn't get on board with this, it will fail. It's like the same as capital gains taxes. If you've got a tax jurisdiction that's 0% like Saudi Arabia, well, anybody who can move their capital is going to do it, right? And if there's a jurisdiction that doesn't have a carbon tax, like that's where dirty industry is going to go. And so we may have not solved this problem and destroyed our economy along the way, right?
Yeah, that's like, I would be fully with you that like if Canada was the only nation doing this, the only one who cared about it, then it would probably be a bad policy. But again, it's lucky that the globe is moving towards this. India is building a ton of renewable systems. China has dropped its coal production, at least as a percentage of its energy system, almost entirely because of renewable energy systems. And they are planning on building much, much more. They lead the globe in renewable energy system development. And we're very likely going to see peak Chinese carbon emissions very soon. And they seem to be committed to it because, again, they understand that carbon dioxide and climate change is going to have a negative impact on their economy and their country. And they have economic drivers in that renewables are so incredibly cheap that it's the best way for them to get cheap power to have a strong economy. So,
well, their emissions are peaking because their population has peaked, and I think that's what you're seeing in the rest of the world as well. I mean, I'll refer to the work of Michael Crichton, who did a good analysis looking at the carbon intensity of a human life over several millennia. And the truth is that we've always been decarbonizing as we move from wood to coal to oil to nat gas, to nuclear and others. Without absent all of this sort of top-down intervention, the Earth is decarbonizing on a per capita basis. And now that humanity has sort of peaked its population growth, this is a trend that's just happening anyways, carbon tax or not. Anyway, so I'm not worried about it, and nor am I worried about the amount of warming that is being forecasted by IPCC. Certainly for Canada, it's a net benefit, but I can appreciate that there are other places that's not the case.
Yeah, I would still push back. Canada's net benefit is largely in part because of the arable area, but also because so many places become uninhabitable that we would get extremely large amounts of immigration, causing the economic prosperity in our nation. When the economic models look at Canada benefiting in any way from climate change, it's largely due to high levels of immigration.
Yeah, the benefits include lower energy needs per capita, increased agricultural area, and the ability to develop resources that were previously inaccessible.
The agricultural area is a little bit hit and miss because it's more predicated on soils. There's a reason that our agricultural centers are near Regina and Edmonton and Calgary and Winnipeg, and that's because that's where the best soils are. So yes, we would get more marginal soils, but where our best soils are, would see decreases, and we've already seen that due to droughts and climate change. And year over year, we're seeing lower yields per acre, only mitigated by the use of more land in Canada. You can look at the Canadian stats.
All right, I gotta look it up. That's my homework. I know that's not true, but I'll look it up.
We've had reduced bushels per acre of things like barley and oats and wheat and corn, and we've only made up for that by increasing our land.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: is that a lot of this concern around heat is when you increase levels of CO2, plants' water use efficiency goes up a lot. It's dramatic. Actually, that's my profession. Is I know a lot about plant phys because I was in controlled environments, agriculture, and I've worked in greenhouses that are 45C. And I know what can be accomplished in that kind of environment. So really, the losses associated are really relating to the hydrological cycle. But that is both a give and a take, because places that formerly were wet become dry. Those who are dry, they become wet. The CO2 is actually increasing drought heat tolerance in crops and increasing yields. We are absolutely not having a food crisis. We're peak humanity, but yields continue to climb, and and that's without even tapping all of this land that may become available.
You're talking about total yields, not yield per acre, or the amount of fertilizer we have to add, or anything like that.
I'm talking yield per acre. I am. That's what I am talking about. Yeah.
Possibly in a greenhouse where you can control all of the factors. That's usually where you see the
field
best
production
outcomes.
as well. That's. Okay. I'll find you let it be my homework to put that in the thread to this, and we can carry on the conversation with a little bit of a tweet storm. But Canada, the ugly truth that nobody wants to admit is that Canada will dramatically benefit from climate change, and I don't take government paid scientists as independent assessors on this.
I'm not saying that it won't. I'm just saying that any benefits that we get probably won't be large, and there's kind of it's a toss-up for Canada in terms of the potential for that, because the global world having worse economic outputs will obviously make our overall economic growth worse as well, because we have a globalized economy where we're able to use global trade as a mechanism to
redistribute food, right? And that's what we've been doing for a long time.
To have economic prosperity.
No, but like when you talk about global food insecurity, it is not because of climate change. It's absolutely because populations exploded in jurisdictions where the landmass can't support them. Like there has not been enough climate change, to even in the worst affected areas. We're talking about populations that doubled and tripled over like a generation. Like that, the exploding population growth in some African regions is the problem, not the climate.
I'm not sure about that, but
look at a country like Nigeria.
Yeah,
right?
Again, like I would look more to like a place like Ukraine, where they produce a lot of food because they have really good soils. And then how does that global food production get affected? And then how does that affect the poorest nations in the world? Because climate change is inevitably going to increase their total costs for that food.
Well, let's maybe reserve that for a future debate about the food systems, because I think there's important data there that maybe you haven't had a look at. But anyways, we should be really planning for a future where Canada is a bigger agricultural powerhouse than it is today. And because I know folks that live down in southwestern Ontario, the Mennonites, who make their living on agriculture, and they're actually moving North Bay and Sault Ste. Marie, because the land down here is up for development, and they have no problem making a living off the land further north.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Edmonton, it's quite north and it has really good soils, and that's why we can grow food up there.
Well,
so
it's the same thing around Hudson's Bay. A lot, there's just huge tracts of land along the north that are actually decent soil quality. If you look at those, the Canadian soils quality. So, anyways, I appreciate the time with you, D-Cubed and Payman. Thanks for having us on. It's been a blast.
No, thank you, gentlemen. I'm just going to ask you guys to hang back when I end the stream. D-Cubed, thank you very much. Buck, thank you very much. You guys, you're a wealth of information.
I was going to ask, I saw a lot of questions come up.
Oh yeah,
they weren't really questions. There was one guy I can ask you. I'm gonna jokingly
to be
say,
fair, I know who Soyotl is. We're going to be having a debate on nuclear anyway. So he's getting his jabs in while he can.
No, there was definitely a lot of salt in the comments, but somebody was asking. It's like the mariachi effect, the Malinkovich effect cycle. What is that?
The Milankovitch cycles.
Yeah.
Those are too long to be worthy of this conversation, to be honest.
Yeah, it's basically just natural cycles that cause long-term fluctuations in climate.
These are on the thousands of years scale.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you again. Just hang back, but thank you very much to both of you, and I'm sure the audience appreciated the debate.
Yeah.
Thanks, DQ.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
And we're off. Dude.